The winter of 1887 came early to the Colorado Territory, descending upon the high plains like a vengeful spirit wrapped in sheets of ice and snow. Thomas Mackenzie had seen harsh winters before in his 34 years, but nothing quite like the blizzard that began forming on the horizon that November morning. The sky turned the color of old pewter, and the wind carried a bite that seemed to cut straight through a man's bones, no matter how many layers of wool and leather he wore. Thomas stood on the porch of his small ranch house, watching the storm clouds gather with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read the language of the sky. His weathered hands gripped the wooden railing as he studied the approaching wall of white. The cattle in his pasture seemed to sense what was coming too. They huddled together near the barn, their breath forming small clouds in the increasingly frigid air. He had built this place with his own hands over the past 5 years, carving out a modest existence from the unforgiving landscape. The ranch wasn't much to look at: a simple log cabin, a small barn, and enough fencing to contain his small herd of cattle, but it represented something more valuable than gold to Thomas: independence. After years of drifting from town to town, working other men's ranches and following other men's orders, he had finally found a place where he could stand on his own ground and answer to no one but himself. The nearest town, Cedar Ridge, lay 23 miles to the east, connected to his ranch by a winding trail that snaked through rocky canyons and across open meadowland. It was a journey that took the better part of a day in good weather, but in conditions like what was brewing overhead, it could become a death sentence for the unprepared. Thomas had made the ride countless times, delivering cattle to market and picking up supplies, but he had never attempted it in weather that promised to be as severe as what was approaching. As the first snowflakes began to fall, fat, heavy flakes that seemed to materialize out of the darkening sky, Thomas made his way to the barn to secure his animals for what was clearly going to be a significant storm. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Buck, nickered softly as Thomas entered the warm interior of the barn. The smell of hay and leather and animal warmth provided a comforting contrast to the increasingly hostile world outside. Thomas had learned long ago that preparation was the key to survival in this harsh country. He checked his stores of hay and grain, ensuring that his animals would have enough feed to last through several days of confinement. He reinforced the barn door and checked the roof for any potential weak points where the weight of snow might cause problems. These were the practical considerations that separated those who thrived on the frontier from those who merely survived or didn't survive at all. But, as he worked, his mind kept drifting to something that had been troubling him for the past several weeks. On his last trip to Cedar Ridge, he had overheard a conversation in the saloon that had stuck with him like a burr under a saddle. Two men, both wearing the rough clothes of buffalo hunters, had been discussing their recent travels through the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to the south. They spoke of having seen smoke from Apache campfires in areas where no smoke should have been, areas far from the designated reservation lands where the Apache were supposed to remain. The Apache had been a constant presence in this part of the territory for as long as anyone could remember. Some were peaceful, content to remain on the reservations and adapt to the new ways that the government insisted they adopt. Others were not so easily contained. Small bands of warriors still roamed the mountains and canyons, sometimes trading peacefully with isolated ranchers and settlements, sometimes raiding when desperation or anger drove them to it. Thomas had encountered Apache before, both hostile and friendly, and he had developed a healthy respect for their ability to survive in country that would kill most white men within a matter of days. He had also developed an understanding that their situation was far more complex than most settlers cared to acknowledge. The Apache were not simply savages to be feared or removed, they were people caught between two worlds, struggling to maintain their way of life in the face of forces that seemed determined to erase everything they had ever known. The conversation in the saloon had been troubling not because it suggested that Apache were in the area, but because of what the buffalo hunters had said next. They claimed to have seen evidence of a small camp, not a war party, but what appeared to be a family group, possibly including women and children. The hunters had not approached the camp, but they had noted its location and had mentioned their intention to report it to the territorial authorities when they returned to Denver. Thomas knew what that meant. Within a matter of days or weeks, a cavalry patrol would be dispatched to investigate. If they found Apache off the reservation, the encounter would likely end badly for everyone involved. The Apache would be forced to return to reservation lands that could barely support the population already living there, or they would resist and face the overwhelming firepower of the U.S. Army. Either outcome would result in suffering for people who were already struggling to survive in an increasingly hostile world. As the storm intensified outside, Thomas found himself thinking about the implications of what the buffalo hunters had reported. The location they had described was roughly 15 miles southwest of his ranch, in an area of broken canyon country that provided natural shelter and access to water. It was exactly the kind of place where a small group might hope to wait out the winter months, living off the land and avoiding contact with the outside world. The wind began to howl around the barn with increasing ferocity, rattling the wooden walls and causing the animals to shift nervously in their stalls. Thomas could hear the snow building up against the doors and walls, and he knew that by morning, his ranch would be buried under several feet of white. Travel would be impossible for anyone except those with the most desperate of motivations. But, as he settled down for what promised to be a long, cold night, Thomas couldn't shake the image of Apache families huddled in whatever shelter they could find, facing the same storm that was battering his well-built barn. He thought of children and elders who might not have adequate clothing or food to survive several days of blizzard conditions. He thought of the difficult choices that parents might be forced to make when their children's lives hung in the balance. Thomas had seen enough of death in his 34 years to understand its finality. He had lost his own family, a wife and infant daughter, to cholera 5 years earlier, a tragedy that had driven him to seek solitude on this remote ranch. The memory of their suffering, and of his own helplessness in the face of forces beyond his control, had left him with a deep understanding of how quickly circumstances could turn from difficult to desperate to fatal. By midnight, the storm had reached its full fury. The wind screamed across the open country with a voice that seemed almost alive, carrying with it a cargo of snow so thick that visibility was reduced to mere inches. Thomas lay in his bunk in the barn, wrapped in heavy blankets and listening to the assault of the elements against his small sanctuary. His house, though warmer, was less secure in storms like this, and he had learned that it was better to remain close to his animals, where he could monitor their condition and respond quickly if problems arose. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the constant noise of the storm and by thoughts that would not rest. He found himself imagining what it would be like to be caught in the open in conditions like this, the bitter cold that would numb exposed skin within minutes, the disorienting whiteout conditions that could cause even experienced outdoorsmen to lose their bearings and wander in circles until exhaustion and hypothermia claimed them. He thought of the Apache camp that might or might not exist 15 miles away, and of the people who might be facing the storm with far less protection than his sturdy barn provided. When dawn finally came, it brought little relief from the storm's intensity. The wind had lessened somewhat, but snow continued to fall steadily, adding to drifts that had already reached heights of 4 and 5 feet in places. Thomas dug his way out of the barn and struggled through the knee-deep snow to check on his house, where he found that several windows had been blocked completely by accumulated snow. The world had been transformed overnight into an alien landscape of white, where familiar landmarks had disappeared beneath uniformly smooth drifts. After seeing to his immediate needs and those of his animals, Thomas found himself standing once again on his porch, staring out into the white wilderness that surrounded his ranch. Visibility had improved enough to see perhaps 50 yards in any direction, but, beyond that, the world simply disappeared into a wall of falling snow and wind-driven crystals that glittered like diamonds in the pale morning light. It was then that he saw them. At first, they were just dark shapes moving slowly across the white expanse, barely visible through the blowing snow. Thomas squinted, wiping ice crystals from his eyes and straining to make sense of what he was seeing. The shapes moved with purpose but without haste, and, as they drew closer, he could see that they were human figures, bundled in dark clothing and struggling through the deep snow with obvious difficulty. Thomas grabbed his rifle from inside the house, not out of hostility, but from the ingrained caution that had kept him alive in dangerous country for many years. He watched as the figures approached, noting that they moved in the careful, measured way of people who were conserving their strength for a long journey. When they were close enough for him to make out details, his breath caught in his throat. 2 young Apache girls, neither of them appearing to be older than 12 or 13, were making their way across the snow-covered pasture toward his house. They wore traditional Apache clothing, deerskin dresses and high moccasins, supplemented by heavy woolen blankets that they had wrapped around their shoulders and heads. Even from a distance, Thomas could see that they were exhausted. Their movements were sluggish, and they stopped frequently to rest, supporting each other as they struggled through snow that reached nearly to their waists. Thomas set his rifle aside and grabbed his coat, his mind racing as he tried to understand what could have driven these children to venture out into such deadly conditions. He waded through the snow toward them, calling out in what little Apache he knew to let them know that he was not a threat. The girls stopped when they saw him approaching, and he could see the wariness in their dark eyes as they evaluated this white man who had appeared out of the storm. When he reached them, Thomas could see that both girls were in serious trouble. Their lips were blue with cold, and their clothing, though well suited for normal winter conditions, was inadequate for the extreme weather they were facing. One of the girls, the taller of the two, with long black hair that had escaped from beneath her blanket, was clearly the stronger of the pair. She supported her companion, a slightly younger girl whose face was pale and whose movements suggested that she was approaching the limits of her endurance. Thomas spoke to them in English, then tried the few words of Apache he knew, attempting to convey that he wanted to help them. The older girl responded in heavily accented English, her voice barely audible above the wind. "Please," she said, we are looking for." Her words trailed off as exhaustion and cold overcame her ability to speak clearly. Thomas didn't hesitate. He scooped up the smaller girl, who was too weak to protest, and gestured for the older one to follow him back toward the house. The girl hesitated for a moment, clearly torn between the need for shelter and deeply ingrained warnings about trusting white strangers, but the severity of the storm made the choice for her. Thomas carried the unconscious girl into his house and laid her on his bed near the fireplace, while the older girl stood uncertainly by the door, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. Thomas immediately began building up the fire, adding logs until the flames roared and began to drive the bitter cold from the small room. He heated water and began the process of carefully warming the girls, knowing that too much heat too quickly could be as dangerous as the cold they were escaping. As sensation began to return to the younger girl's extremities, she woke with a start, looking around the unfamiliar room with obvious fear. The older girl moved to her side and spoke to her in rapid Apache, apparently explaining their situation and reassuring her that they were, for the moment at least, safe. Thomas prepared hot broth and bread, and watched as the girls slowly began to recover from their ordeal. As they warmed and gained strength, the older girl, who told him her name was Ayana, meaning Eternal Blossom, began to explain why they had risked their lives in the storm. Their story emerged slowly, told in a mixture of Apache and halting English, with long pauses as Ayana searched for words to express concepts that had no direct translation. She and her companion, Kaya, whose name meant Little Sister, were indeed from the camp that the buffalo hunters had discovered. It was a small group, perhaps 20 people in all, led by Ayana's grandfather, an elder named Nayeli who had refused to accept life on the reservation. Nayeli had gathered around him a handful of families who shared his determination to maintain the old ways, even if it meant living in constant danger of discovery and forced relocation. They had spent the past 2 years moving from place to place, always staying ahead of the cavalry patrols that periodically swept through the region looking for Apache who had left the reservation without permission. The group had been camped in a sheltered canyon about 15 miles from Thomas's ranch when the storm had struck. They had prepared as well as they could for winter, but the severity of the blizzard had caught them, like everyone else in the region, by surprise. Their shelter was adequate for normal winter weather, but it was not built to withstand the kind of sustained assault that the current storm was delivering. On the second day of the blizzard, disaster had struck. A gust of wind had torn away part of the covering from their main shelter, exposing several families to the full fury of the storm. In the chaos that followed, as the men struggled to repair the damage in near whiteout conditions, Kaya had wandered away from the camp. Ayana explained that Kaya was not quite right in her mind, a condition that had existed since birth and that made her prone to confusion and poor judgment in stressful situations. When the adults realized that she was missing, search parties had gone out immediately, but the storm made it nearly impossible to find tracks or follow any trail. As hours passed without any sign of the missing girl, hope had begun to fade. It was then that Ayana had made a desperate decision. She knew the general location of the white man's ranch from previous scouting trips, and she believed that Kaya, in her confusion, might have wandered in that direction. Despite the protests of her family and the obvious danger involved, Ayana had set out into the storm to search for her friend. She had found Kaya nearly dead from exposure, collapsed in a snow drift less than a mile from Thomas's ranch. Kaya had no memory of how she had gotten there or how long she had been wandering in the storm, but Ayana knew that without immediate shelter and warmth, both of them would die. The ranch house had been their only hope of survival. As Thomas listened to this story, he found himself facing a decision that would test everything he believed about himself and his place in the world. The girls were safe for the moment, but their situation remained desperate. The storm showed no signs of abating, and even if it did, they would need to return to their people soon or risk being given up for dead. But the journey back to the Apache camp would be extraordinarily dangerous, especially for two young girls traveling alone. The logical choice would be to keep the girls safe until the storm passed, then take them to the authorities in Cedar Ridge. They would be fed and clothed and eventually returned to the reservation, where they would have access to government-provided shelter and food. It would be the safe choice, the responsible choice according to the laws and customs of the territory. But Thomas knew enough about reservation life to understand that it represented a kind of slow death for people like these girls. The Apache who had been confined to reservations lived in poverty and despair, stripped of their traditional ways of life and forced to depend on government handouts that were often inadequate and unreliable. Many had succumbed to diseases that their bodies were not equipped to fight, and others had simply lost the will to live in a world that seemed to have no place for them. As he watched Ayanna tend to her friend with a combination of skill and tenderness that spoke of deep training in traditional healing arts, Thomas began to understand that these were not simply two lost children who needed to be rescued. They were representatives of a way of life that was fighting for its very survival, and they had risked everything to maintain their connection to something larger than themselves. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the small ranch house, a different kind of storm was building in Thomas's mind. He found himself remembering his own struggles to maintain his independence in the face of a world that seemed determined to force him into conformity with its expectations. He thought of the years he had spent working for other men, following their orders and accepting their vision of what his life should be, before finally finding the courage to strike out on his own. He thought of his wife and daughter, and of the helplessness he had felt as he watched them slip away from diseases that better doctors in better hospitals might have been able to treat. He remembered the rage he had felt at a world that allowed good people to die while evil people prospered, and the way that rage had gradually transformed into a determination to live life on his own terms, regardless of what others might think or expect. Looking at these two Apache girls, Thomas saw something of his own struggle reflected back at him. They were fighting for their right to exist as they chose to exist, even if that meant accepting risks and hardships that others might consider unacceptable. They had not chosen the easy path of submission and assimilation, they had chosen the harder path of resistance and self-determination. As the day wore on and the storm continued to pound the small ranch house, Thomas found himself drawn into conversations with Ayanna that revealed the depth of thought and wisdom that lay beneath her young exterior. She spoke of her grandfather's teachings about the importance of maintaining connections to the land and to the old ways, even in the face of overwhelming pressure to abandon them. She described the daily struggles of their small band to find food and shelter while avoiding the cavalry patrols that could end their freedom at any moment. But she also spoke of the joy they found in their chosen life, the satisfaction of living according to ancient rhythms and traditions, the deep sense of community that bound their small group together, and the spiritual connection to the natural world that gave meaning to their daily struggles. Her words painted a picture of a life that was hard but rich, dangerous but meaningful, uncertain but authentic. As evening approached and the storm finally began to show signs of weakening, Thomas knew that he would soon have to make a choice that would define not only the fate of these two girls, but his own understanding of who he was and what he stood for. The easy choice lay before him: wait for the storm to pass, then deliver the girls to the authorities and return to his quiet life as an isolated rancher. It was the choice that would involve the least risk and the least disruption to his carefully ordered existence. But, as he looked at Ayanna and Kaya, he began to understand that some choices are not really choices at all. They are tests of character that reveal who we really are beneath the layers of caution and compromise that we accumulate over the years. They are moments when we must decide whether we will act according to our deepest convictions or submit to the expectations and pressures of the world around us. Thomas Mackenzie had spent the first part of his adult life allowing others to define his path and determine his choices. He had followed orders and met expectations and lived according to other people's vision of what his life should be. It was only after losing everything that mattered most to him that he had found the strength to choose his own way, to build something with his own hands on his own land according to his own vision. Now, faced with two Apache girls who represented everything he had come to admire about the courage to live authentically, Thomas found himself at another crossroads. He could choose safety and conformity, or he could choose to honor the part of himself that understood the value of self-determination, even when it came at great personal cost. Part 2, The Choice in the Storm. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Thomas made his decision, and the snow had stopped falling, leaving behind a world transformed into something both beautiful and treacherous. Drifts 10 feet high had reshaped the familiar landscape around his ranch into an alien territory of smooth white curves and sharp-edged crevasses that could swallow a man without warning. The silence was profound, the kind of deep, crystalline quiet that only came after severe storms, when the world seemed to hold its breath in appreciation of its own survival. Thomas stood at his window, watching the late afternoon sun break through the clouds for the first time in 3 days. The light struck the snow-covered terrain and exploded into millions of tiny diamonds, creating a display of natural beauty that was almost painful to look at directly. But beneath the beauty lay harsh reality: temperatures that could kill an unprepared person within hours, and travel conditions that would challenge even the most experienced outdoorsman. Behind him, Ayanna and Kaya sat near the fire, their strength largely restored after 2 days of rest and regular meals. They had spoken little about their plans for leaving, but Thomas could see in their movements and expressions that they were preparing themselves mentally for the dangerous journey back to their people. Every hour that passed increased the likelihood that their families would believe them dead, and Thomas knew that prolonged absence would cause the kind of grief and disruption that could tear their small community apart. But Thomas also knew that allowing them to leave on their own would likely be sending them to their deaths. The journey to their camp would require crossing open country where the snow was still knee-deep, navigating through areas where familiar landmarks had been obliterated by the storm, and doing all of this while maintaining the strength and warmth necessary for survival. 2 young girls, even ones as capable as these appeared to be, would be facing odds that no reasonable person would accept. The conversation that would determine their fate began quietly, almost accidentally, as Thomas was explaining the local geography to Ayanna. He had drawn a rough map in the dirt by the fireplace, showing her the location of his ranch in relation to the canyon where she believed her people were camped. As he traced the route with his finger, marking the areas of open ground and the places where shelter might be found, he found himself speaking aloud thoughts that had been forming in his mind throughout the day. "The hardest part will be the first 5 miles, he said, studying the crude map. "There's no shelter at all across the flats, and if another storm comes up, there's nowhere to take cover. After that, you get into the broken country where there are rocks and trees, but the going gets slower because of the terrain." Ayanna nodded, her dark eyes fixed on the map as she committed its details to memory. "We must go soon," she said. "Our people will think we are dead. They will begin the mourning ceremonies." "Going now would be suicide," Thomas replied, more sharply than he had intended. "The snow is still too deep, and the cold hasn't broken yet. You'd never make it halfway." Kaya, who had been silent for most of the past 2 days, suddenly spoke up. Her English was more limited than Ayanna's, but her words carried a weight that surprised Thomas. "Better to die trying to go home than to die as prisoners," she said, her voice soft but determined. "We will go tonight, when the moon rises." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the cabin's log walls. He looked at these 2 young girls, children, really, despite their obvious maturity and self-possession, and saw in their faces the same stubborn determination that he recognized in himself. They would rather face almost certain death than accept what they saw as betrayal of their people and their way of life. "There's another choice," Thomas heard himself saying, though he hadn't consciously decided to speak the words. "I could take you back myself." The silence that followed his statement seemed to stretch for minutes, though it probably lasted only a few seconds. Ayanna and Kaya looked at each other, and Thomas could see them communicating in the wordless way that close friends develop over years of shared experience. When Ayanna finally spoke, her voice carried a note of suspicion. "Why would you do this? You do not know us. We are nothing to you." Thomas found that he didn't have an easy answer to her question. Why would he risk his own life and safety to help 2 Apache girls return to a group of people who were, according to territorial law, criminals living illegally off the reservation? Why would he involve himself in a situation that could only bring him trouble with the authorities and potentially put his own ranch and livelihood at risk? I don't know, he said finally, and the honesty in his voice seemed to surprise all three of them. Maybe because I understand what it means to want to live free, even when other people think you're making the wrong choice. Ayana studied his face for a long moment, and Thomas had the uncomfortable feeling that she was seeing far more than he was comfortable revealing. When she spoke again, her voice was gentler, but no less serious. If you help us, you will become an enemy of your own people. They will say you are an Indian lover, a traitor. They may take your land, put you in prison. Is our freedom worth that much to you? Thomas thought about her question as he poked at the fire with an iron rod, watching the flames dance and shift in response to the additional oxygen. Was their freedom worth the potential destruction of everything he had worked to build over the past 5 years? Was it worth the risk of imprisonment, or worse if he was caught helping Apache fugitives? 5 years ago, he said slowly, I lost my wife and daughter to cholera. They died because the nearest doctor was 3 days away, and by the time we got them to help, it was too late. I spent a long time after that being angry at the disease, angry at the distance, angry at a world that seemed designed to take away everything that mattered. He paused, remembering those dark months when grief had nearly destroyed his will to continue living. After a while, I realized that the anger wasn't helping anyone. It wasn't bringing them back, and it wasn't making me a better man. So I decided to come out here and build something with my own hands, something that would be mine and no one else's. Ayana and Kaya listened without interrupting, and Thomas could see that his words were reaching them in ways that surprised him. I learned that freedom isn't just about having your own land or making your own choices, he continued. It's about being able to live according to what you believe is right, even when other people disagree with you. Your grandfather understood that when he decided to leave the reservation. He chose to risk everything rather than accept a life that felt like death to him. Thomas stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the snow-covered landscape that stretched away toward the mountains where Ayana's people were waiting. I guess I understand the choice better than I understood before. Sometimes staying safe isn't really living at all. When he turned back to face the girls, he saw that Ayana was crying silently, tears running down her cheeks as she stared into the fire. Kaya had moved closer to her friend and was holding her hand, offering the kind of wordless comfort that transcends language and cultural barriers. We cannot ask you to do this thing, Ayana said finally, her voice thick with emotion. The risk is too great. We will find our own way home. You're not asking, Thomas replied. I'm offering. And I'm not doing it just for you, I'm doing it because I need to know that I'm still the kind of man who can choose what's right over what's safe. The decision, once made, brought with it a sense of clarity that Thomas had not expected. The practical considerations were significant. He would need to prepare for a dangerous journey through difficult terrain and harsh weather conditions, and he would need to do it in a way that minimized the risk of being discovered by cavalry patrols or other authorities. But, beneath the practical concerns lay a deeper sense of rightness, a feeling that he was finally acting in accordance with his deepest values rather than simply reacting to circumstances beyond his control. The preparations took the rest of that day and part of the next. Thomas packed his saddlebags with food, blankets, and other supplies that would be necessary for the journey. He selected his warmest clothing and his most reliable gear, knowing that equipment failure in the conditions they would be facing could easily prove fatal. He cleaned and loaded his rifle and his pistol, not because he expected trouble, but because traveling unarmed in dangerous country was a luxury that no sensible person could afford. More challenging than the physical preparations were the mental and emotional adjustments that the decision required. Thomas had spent the past 5 years learning to live alone, to depend only on himself and to avoid entanglements that might compromise his independence. Now he was voluntarily taking responsibility not only for his own safety, but for the lives of 2 young Apache girls who represented everything that the territorial authorities considered dangerous and subversive. As he worked, Thomas found himself thinking about the broader implications of what he was doing. He was not simply helping 2 lost children find their way home, he was making a statement about where he stood on the fundamental questions that were reshaping the American West. He was choosing to side with people who refused to accept the government's vision of their proper place in society, people who insisted on maintaining their own culture and their own way of life despite overwhelming pressure to assimilate or disappear. It was a choice that would have been incomprehensible to the younger Thomas Mackenzie, the man who had followed orders and accepted other people's definitions of right and wrong without question. But the man who had built this ranch with his own hands, who had learned to survive and prosper in one of the harshest environments on earth, understood that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were overwhelmingly against success. The night before their departure, as the three of them sat around the fire sharing what might be their last hot meal together, Ayanna began to tell Thomas about her grandfather and the reasons why he had chosen to lead his small band away from the reservation. The story that emerged was not one of simple rebellion or hatred of white society, but rather a complex narrative about the struggle to maintain identity and dignity in the face of forces that seemed determined to erase both. Nayeli had been a war leader in his younger days, a man who had fought fiercely against the encroachment of white settlers and soldiers into Apache territory. But he had also been a pragmatist who understood that armed resistance could not succeed indefinitely against the overwhelming numbers and resources of the U.S. military. When the final defeat came and the Apache were forced onto reservations, Nayeli had initially tried to adapt to the new conditions and to help his people make the transition to a different way of life. For 3 years, he had lived on the San Carlos reservation, attempting to farm the poor soil and learning to navigate the complex bureaucracy that controlled every aspect of Apache life. He had watched his people struggle with diseases for which they had no immunity, and he had seen the traditional social structures that had sustained Apache culture for centuries begin to crumble under the pressure of forced assimilation. The breaking point had come when government officials had announced plans to take Apache children away from their families and send them to boarding schools in distant states, where they would be educated in white ways and forbidden to speak their native language or practice their traditional religion. Nayeli had seen this policy as nothing less than an attempt to destroy the Apache people by severing the connection between generations and eliminating the transmission of cultural knowledge that gave meaning to Apache life. Rather than submit to what he saw as the final destruction of his people, Nayeli had gathered around him a small group of families who shared his determination to preserve the old ways. They had left the reservation quietly, in small groups over a period of several months, until they had assembled in the remote canyon where they now made their home. They lived simply, hunting and gathering as their ancestors had done, moving frequently to avoid detection, and maintaining the religious and social practices that gave their lives meaning. It was not an easy existence. They were constantly at risk of discovery and forced return to the reservation, and they lived without access to the medical care and other services that reservation life provided. Winters were especially difficult, as they had to rely entirely on their own resources and traditional knowledge to survive the harsh mountain weather. But, despite the hardships, Ayanna explained, the people in her grandfather's band had found something that had been missing from their lives on the reservation: the ability to live according to their own values and to pass those values on to their children. As Thomas listened to this story, he began to understand that what he was preparing to do was not simply an act of individual heroism or charity. He was participating in a larger struggle over the right of people to determine their own fate, to live according to their own understanding of what gave life meaning and purpose. The Apache who had followed Nayeli into the mountains were fighting for the same thing that Thomas himself had sought when he left his old life behind and built his ranch in this isolated corner of the territory. When dawn came, clear and bitterly cold, Thomas was ready. He had saddled Buck and loaded the horse with supplies carefully distributed to maintain balance and minimize bulk. He had dressed in layers that would provide warmth without restricting movement, and he had equipped himself with snowshoes that would be essential for travel across the deeper drifts. Most importantly, he had mentally prepared himself for a journey that would test every skill he had developed during his years on the frontier. Ayanna and Kaya emerged from the cabin wrapped in blankets that Thomas had insisted they take, along with additional food and a pair of his smallest boots for Kaya, whose moccasins were inadequate for the conditions they would face. They moved with the quiet efficiency of people who had learned to travel light and fast, carrying only what was absolutely essential for survival. Before they set out, Thomas took a long look at his ranch, the cabin he had built with his own hands, the barn where his cattle waited for his return, the fences and corrals that represented years of patient labor. There was no guarantee that he would see any of it again. If they were caught by a cavalry patrol, he might face charges that could result in imprisonment or worse. Even if they completed the journey successfully, his involvement with Apache fugitives might make him a marked man in the eyes of territorial authorities. But, as he looked at his ranch, Thomas realized that it had never been the buildings or the land themselves that mattered to him. What mattered was what they represented: the freedom to live according to his own choices and his own understanding of what was right. If he abandoned that principle now, out of fear for his own safety, then the ranch would become nothing more than a prison, and he would be nothing more than a coward hiding behind walls he had built to protect himself from having to make difficult choices. Thomas mounted Buck and gestured for the girls to walk alongside the horse, where they could grab onto the stirrups if they needed support in the deep snow. The sun was just clearing the eastern mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink that made the harsh terrain look almost inviting. But Thomas knew that the beauty was deceptive. Beneath the pristine surface lay conditions that could kill the unprepared within hours. As they set out across the open flats that lay between the ranch and the broken country where the Apache camp was hidden, Thomas found himself thinking about the conversation he had had with Ayanna the night before. She had asked him a question that had stayed with him through the sleepless hours: what if we are wrong? What if our way is truly dead, and we are fighting for something that can never be? Thomas hadn't known how to answer that question then, and he still didn't know now. Perhaps the Apache way of life was doomed, as so many other traditional cultures had been doomed by the relentless expansion of industrial civilization. Perhaps Nayeli's small band was engaged in a hopeless struggle against forces that would ultimately prove too powerful to resist. But, as they made their way across the snow-covered landscape, with the two Apache girls walking steadily beside his horse and the mountains rising ahead of them like a promise of sanctuary, Thomas began to understand that the question of ultimate success or failure was less important than the question of whether they could live with themselves if they chose not to fight. Some things were worth defending even if they could not be saved, because the act of defending them was what defined the defenders as human beings worthy of respect. The journey to the Apache camp would take them the better part of 2 days, if all went well. They would need to cross 15 miles of difficult terrain, much of it through areas where cavalry patrols were known to operate. They would face bitter cold, treacherous footing, and the constant risk of storms that could force them to seek shelter in exposed locations where discovery would be almost certain. But, as they settled into the rhythm of travel, with Buck's hooves crunching steadily through the crusted snow and the girls moving with the effortless endurance of people accustomed to long journeys on foot, Thomas felt a sense of rightness that he had not experienced in years. He was no longer simply surviving, no longer simply protecting himself and his possessions from the challenges of frontier life. He was actively choosing his path according to his deepest convictions, regardless of the personal cost. The man who had left his ranch that morning was not the same man who had built it 5 years earlier. The Thomas Mackenzie who had fled to the wilderness after losing his family had been broken, angry, and focused primarily on protecting himself from further pain. The man who was now guiding two Apache girls toward their hidden sanctuary had learned that some forms of protection required engagement rather than withdrawal, courage rather than caution. As the sun climbed higher and the temperature began to rise slightly, making travel somewhat easier, Thomas found himself looking forward to meeting Nayeli and the other members of the Apache band. He wanted to understand more about people who had chosen freedom over security, authenticity over acceptance, struggle over surrender. He suspected that he had much to learn from them about what it meant to live according to principles rather than simply reacting to circumstances. But, first, they had to survive the journey. The easy part was behind them now, the open flats where the snow was deep but the footing was relatively secure. Ahead lay the broken country where every step would require careful consideration, where a wrong turn could lead them into an impassable canyon or onto slopes where avalanches waited like sleeping giants. It was country that demanded respect, patience, and the kind of intimate knowledge that could only be gained through years of experience. As they approached the first line of rocky hills that marked the beginning of the challenging terrain, Thomas felt the familiar mixture of excitement and apprehension that came with entering dangerous country. But, beneath those familiar emotions lay something new, a sense of purpose that went beyond mere survival or personal achievement. For the first time in years, he was traveling towards something rather than away from it, and the difference was more profound than he had expected. The hardest part of the journey lay ahead, but Thomas Mackenzie had never felt more prepared to face whatever challenges awaited them in the mountains. Part 3, the unexpected resistance. The canyon where Nayeli's people had made their winter camp was a hidden sanctuary carved deep into the mountainside by centuries of flowing water and shifting stone. Towering walls of red sandstone rose on both sides, creating a natural fortress that was invisible from more than a few hundred yards away and accessible only through a narrow opening that could be easily defended or concealed. A small stream ran along the canyon floor, providing fresh water even in the depths of winter, and scattered groves of pine and juniper offered both shelter and fuel for fires. It had taken Thomas and the two girls nearly 30 hours to make the journey from his ranch, including a night spent huddled under an overhanging rock formation while another wave of snow swept through the mountains. They had arrived at the canyon entrance exhausted, cold, and deeply relieved to have completed the dangerous trek without encountering cavalry patrols or falling victim to the treacherous conditions that had claimed so many other travelers in the harsh winter landscape. Thomas had expected to be welcomed as a savior, the white man who had risked everything to return two missing girls to their worried families. He had anticipated expressions of gratitude, perhaps even a celebration of sorts to mark the safe return of Ayana and Kaya. What he encountered instead was something far more complex and challenging than anything he had prepared himself to face. The first sign that things would not go according to his expectations came when they were still several hundred yards from the main camp. A young Apache warrior, no more than 18 or 19 years old, emerged from behind a boulder with his rifle trained on Thomas's chest. The warrior's face was painted with the stark black and white patterns of a man prepared for war, and his eyes held the kind of cold determination that Thomas had seen before in men who had already decided that death was preferable to defeat. "Stop where you are," the warrior commanded in English that was surprisingly clear and precise. "Drop your weapons and step away from your horse." Thomas raised his hands slowly, making no sudden movements that might provoke the young man into pulling the trigger. "I've brought your girls home," he said, gesturing toward Ayana and Kaya. "They were lost in the storm. I gave them shelter and brought them back safely." The warrior's expression did not change, but Thomas could see him processing this information, weighing the truth of the words against the evidence of his own eyes. After a moment, he spoke a few rapid sentences in Apache to the girls, who responded with what appeared to be a detailed explanation of their experiences. Throughout the exchange, the rifle remained pointed at Thomas's chest. When the conversation was finished, the warrior lowered his weapon slightly, but his stance remained tense and ready for action. "You will come with me to see Nayeli," he said. "But understand this: if you have come here to harm our people or to learn the location of our camp so that you can report it to the soldiers, you will not leave this canyon alive." Thomas nodded his understanding, recognizing in the young man's words the kind of hard pragmatism that was necessary for survival in their precarious situation. As they made their way deeper into the canyon, he began to see signs of the Apache camp: wisps of smoke rising from carefully concealed fires, the tracks of horses and people in the snow, and the subtle modifications to natural shelters that spoke of skilled outdoor living. The camp itself was a marvel of adaptation and concealment. Rather than clustering their shelters in a single location that would be easy to spot from above, the Apache had scattered their dwellings throughout the canyon, using natural rock formations and stands of trees to hide the signs of human habitation. Traditional brush shelters, called wickiups, had been supplemented with more substantial winter dwellings built into cave-like openings in the canyon walls. The overall effect was of a community that had grown organically out of the landscape itself, as much a part of the natural environment as the stream that flowed through its center. As they approached the largest of the shelters, Thomas could see people emerging from various hiding places to observe his arrival. Men, women, and children gathered at a respectful distance, their faces showing the same mixture of curiosity and wariness that he had seen in the young warrior who had intercepted them. These were people who had learned to be suspicious of strangers, especially white strangers, and Thomas could feel the weight of their collective scrutiny as he was led toward what was obviously the dwelling of their leader. Nayeli emerged from his shelter before Thomas reached it, and the old Apache leader's presence was immediately commanding. Though he appeared to be well into his 70s, Nayeli moved with the fluid grace of a much younger man, and his dark eyes held an intelligence and depth of experience that spoke of a life spent making difficult decisions under impossible circumstances. He wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin leggings and a long shirt decorated with intricate beadwork, but Thomas noticed that a modern rifle leaned against the wall of his shelter, a reminder that even the most traditional Apache leaders had been forced to adapt to the realities of their changing world. Ayana and Kaya immediately went to the old man, speaking rapidly in Apache and gesturing frequently toward Thomas. Nayeli listened without interrupting, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts or reactions to their story. When they had finished speaking, he studied Thomas for a long moment, his gaze taking in everything from the white man's travel-stained clothing to the rifle that hung from his saddle. You are the rancher who lives to the east, Nayeli said finally, his English heavily accented but perfectly clear. We have seen your smoke. We have watched your cattle. You live alone, like a man who has been hurt by the world. Thomas was surprised by the directness of the observation and by the accuracy with which this old Apache leader had assessed his situation from a distance. Yes, he said simply. I lost my family. I came here to be alone. But now you are not alone, Nayeli observed, glancing at the two girls who stood nearby. Now you have involved yourself in our troubles. Why did you do this thing? It was the same question that Ayana had asked him back at the ranch, but, coming from Nayeli, it carried additional weight and complexity. Thomas understood that his answer would determine not only how he was received by this community, but whether he would be allowed to leave the canyon alive. These people had learned to trust no one who had not proven themselves worthy of that trust, and the burden of proof rested entirely on his shoulders. Because they needed help, Thomas said, aware of how inadequate the simple answer sounded. And because I understand what it means to want to live free, even when other people think you're making the wrong choice. Nayeli nodded slowly, as if this answer confirmed something he had already suspected. You could have taken them to the soldiers. You could have claimed a reward for returning runaway Apache to the reservation. Instead, you chose to bring them home. This tells me something about your character. The old leader paused, and Thomas could sense that important words were coming. But it also creates a problem for us. You now know where we are. You have seen our defenses, counted our numbers, observed our methods of survival. This knowledge makes you dangerous to us, whether you intend harm or not. Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. He had been so focused on the challenge of getting the girls home safely that he had not fully considered the position he would be placing himself in once he arrived at the camp. From the Apache perspective, he was now a security risk of the highest order, a white man who possessed detailed information about the location and capabilities of a group of people who were actively evading government authorities. I give you my word that I will never reveal anything about this place or these people, Thomas said, but, even as he spoke the words, he realized how hollow they must sound to people who had been betrayed repeatedly by white promises. Nayeli smiled, but there was no humor in his expression. The word of a white man, he said softly. We have heard such words before. We have treaties signed by men who swore by their God that they would keep their promises. Those treaties are broken now, and many of my people are dead because we believed such words. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a middle-aged Apache man whose bearing and demeanor immediately marked him as someone of importance in the community. He spoke urgently to Nayeli in their native language, and Thomas could see from the old leader's expression that he was receiving troubling news. When the messenger had finished speaking, Nayeli turned back to Thomas with a look that was considerably less welcoming than before. My scouts report that soldiers have been seen in the area, he said. A cavalry patrol, perhaps 20 men, moving through the valleys to the north. They appear to be searching for something. Or someone. The implication was clear, and Thomas felt his stomach tighten as he realized what Nayeli was suggesting. You think they're looking for me? That I was followed? I think, Nayeli said carefully, that the timing of their appearance, so soon after your arrival, is very interesting. Perhaps you were more careless than you realized during your journey here. Perhaps someone saw you traveling with Apache girls and reported it to the authorities. Thomas tried to think back over their route, searching his memory for any sign that they might have been observed during the dangerous trek through the mountains. They had been careful to avoid well-traveled paths and to stay away from areas where they might encounter other people, but, in country like this, it was impossible to know who might be watching from concealed positions among the rocks and trees. Or perhaps, added another voice from behind Thomas, he led them here deliberately. Thomas turned to see an Apache man in his 30s, his face scarred by what appeared to be an old wound that ran from his left temple to his jaw. The man's eyes burned with an intensity that spoke of deep anger and long-standing hatred, and Thomas could see in his stance the controlled violence of a warrior who was prepared to act on his suspicions. This is Dakota, Nayeli explained, his voice carrying a note of warning that seemed directed as much at the scarred warrior as at Thomas. He is my war leader, and he has reasons to distrust white men more than most. Dakota stepped closer to Thomas, his hand resting casually on the handle of a knife that hung from his belt. "I was at Sand Creek," he said, his English precise despite his obvious emotional state. "I saw what white soldiers do to Apache women and children when they have the chance. I saw my sister die with her baby in her arms, cut down by men who claimed to be bringing peace to our lands." Thomas had heard stories about Sand Creek, the massacre where Colorado militia had attacked a peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho camp, killing hundreds of people, mostly women and children. It was the kind of atrocity that had hardened attitudes on both sides of the conflict and made peaceful coexistence seem increasingly impossible. "I had nothing to do with Sand Creek," Thomas said quietly. "I've never been a soldier. I've never fought against your people." "But you are white," Dakota replied, his voice growing harder. "And now you are here, in our most secret place, at the same time that soldiers are searching the area. This is not a coincidence that a wise man would ignore." The tension in the canyon was becoming palpable, and Thomas could see that other Apache were gathering nearby, drawn by the rising voices and the obvious conflict that was developing. Some of them were armed, and he could see in their faces the same mixture of suspicion and anger that burned in Dakota's eyes. These were people who had lived too long under threat to give anyone the benefit of the doubt, and Thomas realized that his situation was rapidly becoming desperate. It was Ayanna who broke the deadlock, stepping forward and speaking rapidly to the assembled Apache in their own language. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had earned the right to be heard, and Thomas could see that her words were having an impact on the crowd. Several people nodded in agreement with what she was saying, and even Dakota's expression began to soften slightly. When she had finished speaking, Nayeli translated for Thomas's benefit. "She has told them of your kindness to her and, Kaya, of how you cared for them when they were near death from cold and exhaustion. She has reminded them that you could have taken them to the soldiers and claimed a reward, but instead chose to risk your own life to bring them home. She has also pointed out," added Kaya, speaking for the first time since their arrival at the camp, "that if you had wanted to lead soldiers to us, you would not have needed to come yourself. You could have simply told them where to find us and stayed safely at your ranch." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude toward both girls, but he could see that their words, while influential, had not completely resolved the suspicions that surrounded his presence in the camp. Dakota still watched him with obvious distrust, and several other Apache continued to mutter among themselves in ways that suggested they were far from convinced of his good intentions. It was Nayeli who finally brought the discussion to a resolution, but not in the way that Thomas had hoped. "We will not harm you," the old leader announced, his voice carrying the authority of final decision. "But neither can we allow you to leave, at least not while soldiers are in the area. You will remain here as our guest until we are certain that your presence does not threaten our safety." Thomas understood immediately what this meant. He was to be a prisoner, albeit a well-treated one, until the Apache could determine whether his arrival had indeed brought unwanted attention to their hidden sanctuary. Depending on how events unfolded over the next few days or weeks, his captivity might end with his release or with something considerably more permanent. "I understand," he said, though the words felt like lead in his mouth. "But I want you to know that I came here freely, to help Ayanna and Kaya return to their families. I have no intention of betraying your trust or revealing your location to anyone." "Your intentions may be good," Nayeli replied, "but intentions do not stop bullets or prevent our children from being taken away to schools where they will be taught to forget who they are. Until we know that you have not brought danger to us, you will remain here." As Thomas was led to a small shelter where he would spend his captivity, he found himself reflecting on the irony of his situation. He had come to the canyon expecting to be hailed as a hero for his selfless act of kindness toward two lost girls. Instead, he had found himself trapped in a situation where that same act of kindness had made him a potential threat to the very people he had sought to help. But, as he settled into his temporary prison and listened to the sounds of the Apache camp around him, children playing, women preparing meals, men discussing the day's work, Thomas began to understand that his captivity might offer him something that he had not expected to find. For the first time in years, he was part of a community, albeit an unwilling part. He was surrounded by people who shared a common purpose and a common struggle, people who had chosen principles over comfort and integrity over security. The irony was that in becoming a prisoner of the Apache, Thomas Mackenzie might finally have found the freedom that he had been searching for all his life. But whether that freedom would ultimately cost him his life remained to be seen, as the sounds of approaching hoofbeats began to echo through the canyon, announcing the arrival of the cavalry patrol that would test everyone's resolve in ways they had never imagined. The weak self that Thomas had carried with him for so many years, the man who had allowed others to define his path and determine his choices, was finally being destroyed by the circumstances he now faced. In its place was emerging someone stronger, someone capable of making choices based on principle rather than fear. Whether this new Thomas Mackenzie would survive the challenges ahead remained to be seen, but he had already proven that he could no longer be destroyed by the expectations and pressures of a world that valued conformity over courage. As night fell over the hidden canyon and the first sounds of approaching riders grew clearer in the mountain air, Thomas prepared himself for whatever test lay ahead, knowing that his response to the coming crisis would determine not only his own fate, but the fate of the Apache families who had chosen freedom over safety and authenticity over acceptance. The final confrontation between two very different ways of understanding what it meant to live as a free human being was about to begin, and Thomas Mackenzie found himself standing at the center of a conflict that would define the rest of his life. The man who had entered the canyon that morning as a reluctant hero was about to discover what it truly meant to destroy his weak self in order to become the person he was meant to be.